Right now, Europe has some 400 nuclear warheads deployed, ready to be used on a fairly short notice. Russia, on the other hand, has approximately 2,500 warheads it can use on a short notice. If the US ends up largely pulling out of any peacekeeping deal in Ukraine, and if Europe is largely left by itself to deal with Russia, the difference in nuclear strength might be a card that Russia will play often as a means of deterrence. There has already been talk of increasing nuclear arsenals in Europe, with even some non-nuclear countries gaining nuke weapons. This video will go more in depth, exploring all major options. How might France and UK expand their nuke arsenals, both qualitatively and at what pace? And which other European countries are most likely to go the nuclear route, and how might they do it? Let's explore Europe's new nuclear future. Firstly, why would Europe even need to expand its nuclear arsenal? Well, imagine the following. Russia seemingly relents and allows European peacekeepers in Ukraine. But over time, skirmishes restart and European forces get dragged into those more and more. Eventually, there are real battles going on. And finally, Europe finds itself in an actual war with Russia. Sure, in a normal world, other NATO countries would be there to aid Europe. But with everything that's been going on, it's not 100% assured Europe could count on protection from the US nuclear umbrella. So imagine Europe being at war with Russia. We did a video on force comparison recently, and it was pretty clear that conventionally, Europe is stronger than Russia, which in a way only makes Russia more dangerous. It makes it more likely that it might resort to nuclear weapons, where it has an edge. When it comes to nuclear exchange, Europe is not nearly as well prepared to go head-to-head with Russia. Only the UK and France have their own nukes in Europe. UK's nukes come in the form of submarine-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles. The UK has 4 strategic subs, one of which is always on patrol, one of which is usually in refit without missiles, and 2 of which are populated with missiles and could embark on a deployment within days or weeks. 2021 was the last year the UK reported on the number of its nuclear warheads, saying it had 225, of which 120 were actually deployed on missiles. The rest were in storage. Since then, plans were announced to increase the number of warheads to 260, roughly by the middle of the decade, so it's plausible that right now the UK has close to 250 warheads. The UK doesn't have ballistic missiles of its own, but gets access to the same pool of missiles the US Navy uses. So in a way, the UK leases 58 Trident missiles for multi-year periods until the missiles need to be maintained. Each submarine had deployed with 40 warheads up to 2021, probably using a limited number of missiles, possibly just 8, despite the fact that Vanguard-class subs have 16 missile tubes. But that was then. It's important to note that we don't actually know what's the exact situation today, as the UK is not freely sharing its nuclear information. It's plausible that since the start of the war in Ukraine, Britain started packing more missiles and warheads per sub, and that most of nearly 250 warheads are today kept in active state. In theory, a Trident missile can hold up to 12 small-form warheads, though 8 is a more likely count for the UK. It's also not known what's the current status of low-yield tactical nuke warheads, used for warning, gradual escalation, frontline targets, and so on. Previously, since 1995, a small number of Trident missiles carried a few low-yield warheads, ranging from under 1 kiloton to 10 kilotons in yield. In comparison, the usual Mk4 warhead Britain uses has a 100 kiloton yield. While as of 2021 the tactical nukes were not operational anymore, it's possible those have been reinstated since. An option to gradually escalate the yields would be very desirable in a current geopolitical climate, and especially in the aforementioned escalation scenario in Ukraine. The other nuclear power in Europe is France. It too has 4 strategic subs with a similar deployment and refit cycle. It has 48 ballistic missiles of French design and make, enough for a full load on 3 of the 4 French submarines. The usual load is 4 to 6 warheads per missile, and the yield is the same as on the British missiles, 100 kilotons. There is no reported option of a low-yield tactical nuke warhead for France. Overall, 240 warheads are kept ready for the submarines, as the French keep pretty much all of their arsenal in active status, and not in a stockpile. But crucially, France has another nuclear delivery option. They have the ASMPA nuclear-tipped air-launched missile. It's a big ramjet-powered missile launched by Rafale aircraft. Currently 10 naval and 40 more Air Force Rafales are certified for the nuclear attack role. A similar number of warheads have been produced for the ASMPA. Interestingly, it uses a variable yield warhead. Max yield is 300 kilotons. Lowest yield has not been published, but as the last of the French nuclear tests in the mid-1990s yielded blasts of 8, 20 and 120 kilotons, it's plausible the warhead in question can also provide such variable yields. So how to increase those arsenals? Both the UK and France have ample stockpiles of fissile material. Allegedly, the UK has 22 tons of highly enriched uranium, while France has 25 tons, in addition to 3 and 6 tons of plutonium available for weapons. Basically, each country has enough material to make over 1,000 and possibly up to 2,000 more average yield warheads. So current and foreseeable future stockpiles aren't a problem, even though both France and the UK have stopped production of new fissile materials back in the 1990s. Said production can always be restarted, but with stockpiles so large, a much more pertinent issue is using available existing plutonium and uranium to assemble new warheads. During the 5 years from 1970 to 1975, the UK added 100 newly made warheads. In 5 years from 1985 to 1990, France added 145 new warheads. Assembling new warheads when material and industrial base is available is not something that takes ages. Sure, the said period was one of the Cold War, but one could argue that today we are also in a Cold War already. The Soviets and US were adding 2,000 to 3,000 warheads per year, but they're a completely different category. Still, it's plausible that the current warhead assembly infrastructure, after decades of low activity and cuts, is so low that only several to a dozen warheads can be assembled per year. The UK has a few facilities under construction, like the Mensa Warhead Assembly Facility, Aurora Plutonium Pit Facility, and Pegasus Uranium Processing and Storage Facility. Said facilities are largely delayed and over budget, but it's also possible new requirements were added after Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago. Another indication of a plausible pace of adding new warheads is comparison to how quickly France and the UK initially ramped up their nuclear arsenals back in the 50s and 60s. It took them a decade until the production really picked up to 50 or even 90 per year. It's possible that the current production pace situation is closer to half a dozen per year, similar to the 50s and 60s, rather than the end of the Cold War arsenal increases. So while certain small-scale increases are possible and even probable within the next 12 months, doubling the nuclear arsenals of France and the UK seems unlikely until 2035. Providing the political will, leadership consensus and funding is there, of course. But having a warhead is not enough. To be useful, the warheads need to be delivered to a target. Using a simple bomb as a delivery vehicle is possible, and indeed the US and Russia still have such weapons as well. But those are useful mostly for short-range tactical battlefield work, and they work best if the delivery aircraft itself is well protected, preferably stealthy. In a hypothetical political climate where the US doesn't respect NATO treaty, it would also not be assured the US would allow Britain to integrate its own nuke bombs onto the F-35 planes. It could even be questioned whether the US would support and help maintain the F-35. There's been talk of a US kill switch for the F-35 sold abroad. There isn't one, but it's not really needed. Without US support, most countries' F-35 fleet might be useless within a year. The UK leases Trident ballistic missiles from the US, as said, but those can last a decade without maintenance, so a better part of the UK ballistic missile arsenal would be safe for several years. What Britain would really need is something similar to the French ASMPA missile. Indeed, it would make most sense for Britain to procure the design if the French are willing to share it. It's not that Britain couldn't design something similar, but making a new missile is a lengthy process. Establishing a licensed production could be done in just a few years. France is working on a whole new design to replace the ASMP family. If there is enough political will, Britain could join the program. It would be the fastest way for both countries to get a stealthy hypersonic nuclear-tipped missile. Equally so, if Britain wanted to increase the number of its ICBMs quickly and not depend on the US, the only other option would be France, hoping it could buy or even license produce their M51 missiles. Integrating those to existing British submarines might not be quickly doable though. The French missile is some 20 centimeters wider than the US Trident. Then again, French-owned submarines underwent year-and-a-half-long refits to switch from M45 to M51 missile. The UK is making a new class of submarines, the Dreadnought class. Those two are to carry US missiles, but the first boat has still not been launched, and in theory, changes to the vessels could be done more easily. France and the UK could also agree to redesign the missile itself if the UK paid for it, though that too would take a few years to test. There is simply no quick solution for the UK to get a lot of new ICBMs in just a few years. Even if France wanted to add more ICBM missiles, it would take time. Production would need to be re-established first, and even at its heyday, France made 4 or 5 missiles per year, so ramp up at production facilities would be needed. It's very likely that even by 2030, under 100 missiles could be made in total, theoretically to be shared by France and the UK, again if France allows it, which is a big if, of course. But even such a move would require additional work. Submarines can't be made nearly as quickly. Judging from British Vanguard and French Triomphant-class submarines, from the initial contract to commissioning into service, almost a whole decade usually elapses. So a much quicker solution is to house the ballistic missiles either inside fixed launch silos, which need to be built, or place them on trucks or train cars. That too would require design and construction of specialized vehicles, but in theory it could be done in a few years. And given that Russia lacks means to reliably track launcher vehicles using satellites, it might make the missile on a launcher a bit more survivable than they would be inside a silo. No solution is perfect or quick. The quickest way to add warheads is simply to add them to existing submarine-launched missiles, packing them to the max. If each missile held 10 warheads, France could have 480 nearly ready-to-launch warheads on ICBMs, in addition to dozens of air-launched ones. The UK has just as much room. 3 submarines, each with 16 missiles, could yield 480 warheads. For the UK, the bigger bottleneck could be making 250 more warheads in a short time frame. But adding even more deliverable warheads over said figures could be hard, costly and time-consuming. Doable for sure, but we are talking 2040 or later, rather than 2035 or so time frame. Could other European countries help? Given enough time, sure, but within the said time frame, say 2035, it's almost impossible that any other European country could deploy a useful nuclear arsenal, even if the political willpower was there. Certainly not without the UK or France sharing knowledge and nuclear blast simulation data. Without those, it would be hard to perfect warheads quickly. And it's a huge ask for existing nuclear powers to willingly share their technology with non-nuclear powers. International treaties forbidding that are just one worry, though a big one, as such tech transfers might trigger many other countries around the world to do the same, and we might one day wake up to a world where there are not just 9 nuclear powers in the world, but 20 or 30. Even the US might protest against that, not just Russia. The other obstacle is that the UK and France might not want to share their tech no matter what. Sure, France recently proposed sharing their arsenals with other countries in the EU, But that entails, for example, having ASMPA missiles stored in Germany and some other countries, similar to how some US nuclear bombs are stored in NATO countries to be used by non-US NATO planes. France would still have the last word on usage of said weapons. France's National Rally Party, holding a third of the seats in the parliament, opposes France sharing their nuclear arsenal with anyone. So it would be a rocky road to just share some missiles around, let alone kickstarting someone else's nuclear program technologically. Now, for sure, most developed countries could develop nuclear warheads on their own. Larger economies with a large physicist and industrial base, like Germany and Italy, could probably make one World War II-like bomb in a year or so. That's if they had enough fissile material. Besides France and the UK, only Germany and the Netherlands are known to have uranium enrichment facilities in Europe. But no other country in Europe, besides the UK and France, operates plutonium reprocessing facilities. Plutonium is better for a more compact and efficient weapon, and no one really makes warheads using uranium alone. But even then, it is thought said countries don't store meaningful quantities of uranium, nor enrich it to weapons-grade values. Without outside help to model blasts and without performing actual nuclear test blasts, which have been banned since 1996 by almost every country, it would be quite hard to perfect compact and powerful thermonuclear devices, even for a scientific and industrial power like Germany. Testing all that would again lead to many countries around the world to feel free to do the same, leading to an even less stable world. Basically, other European countries, save for perhaps Germany, are not likely to develop an effective nuclear arsenal in any sort of a meaningful time frame, meaning by 2035 or so. Most could not do it even by 2045. The Polish Prime Minister recently called for Poland to somehow get nuclear protection one way or another, even if it took a long time. A realistic timetable for a country like Poland getting a decent nuclear arsenal with no outside help and own production of fissile material might look something like this. Several years to create a fissile fuel infrastructure, meaning plutonium reprocessing plant, which would also need a nuclear reactor as Poland doesn't have one. Its first commercial one is being constructed and is unlikely to be ready before 2035. So a dedicated wartime production crash course to process plutonium would be needed. Commercial timetables are just too slow. Making uranium enrichment plants would also be needed to make composite plutonium and uranium pits, but that too would take a few years. Subcritical tests, meaning using nuclear material but not achieving critical mass during the reaction, would be important if precise computer models from other countries are unavailable. Pakistan, for example, did dozens of such tests before its true first nuclear test. By 2035, a few useful design prototypes could be assembled, akin to, say, US Mark XII warheads from the 1950s. But that's not a proper nuclear arsenal. Even those would then need some years to be mass-produced. At the same time, delivery systems would be needed. At the very least, some missiles to be fired from aircraft, or medium-range ballistic missiles to be fired from vehicles. Maybe if the whole Polish state was behind it and heeded no warnings from outside, by 2040 several dozen useful missiles with nuke warheads could be in service. All that's highly speculative, of course. Ultimately, making a single nuke bomb, especially if size and delivery are not issues, is not that hard. Most developed nations could do it, using covert means to produce or get their hands on some fissile material. But getting a light miniaturized warhead, small enough to be placed into a tactical missile, is another thing. And to produce enough of those quickly, that is yet another challenge. Small quantities of smuggled fissile materials would not suffice for a proper arsenal. Making large ballistic missiles which could hold larger, less advanced warheads would be a separate challenge in itself, often taking decades to perfect, leading to an even greater need of fissile materials, as the bomb efficiency would be quite bad. If Europe wants to go head-to-head with Russia, a few decades might be needed. Even then, it's unlikely the Russian nuclear arsenal would be matched. But if there is enough political will, unity and funding, France and the UK could expand their arsenals to almost 1,000 warheads combined, by 2035 or so, and base a small number of those in other countries, if they decide that's in their interest. The question of whether today's 550 warheads or tomorrow's 1,000 warheads is enough to go toe-to-toe with Russia is an interesting one, depending on many variables, like early warning, target types and numbers, warhead yields, and so on. But it's also outside the scope of this video. Let's hope we will never actually find out. And remember, Binkov may talk about war, but only real peace can bring us all together.